I'm delighted to be here today and present our research with Whirlpool Corporation. Thank you very much for attending. I will present some of the background to this problem and this research, and Peter will carry on with the questions the client faced, the model we developed, the impact, and the portability of the model. For those of you who might not know, Whirlpool Corporation is the leading manufacturer and marketer of major home appliances. It has $11 billion in sales and almost $4 billion in market capitalization. It has a full line of appliances, including 11 brand names in over 170 countries of the world. It is also the largest appliance supplier to Sears, which sells under its own brand names. Whirlpool's philosophy is a strong commitment to develop appliances for consumers, which removes the drudgery and the time it takes to do household chores. So, as they say, consumers will have more time to spend on themselves, their friends, and their family. In 1990, Whirlpool developed a brand new appliance category, which was the first major innovation in the last 30 years. In the course of developing strategy to market this product, they approached us to see if we could advise them about how this product would fare based on our research on the takeoff of new consumer products, which was published in Marketing Science. I'd like to play a couple of clips for you which show how and what this product is and how it works.
The morning rush. You're ready to get dressed, but your clothes aren't ready to wear. Introducing the Personal Valet Clothes Vitalizing System, an all-new appliance from Whirlpool. It's the revolutionary way to remove wrinkles and clean odors in about 30 minutes. The Personal Valet system works with Perceiva heat-activated formula. While you handle the rest of your morning, inside a patented process circulates a penetrating mist through every fiber, dramatically reducing ironing and saving you trips to the dry cleaner. Now you can gently care for dry clean only and washable items right at home. Just imagine an easier way to look and feel great every day. To learn more about the new Personal Valet system from Whirlpool Corporation, call now or visit us online. We'll send you information to answer all your questions and show you how to change the way you care for your clothes forever with the remarkable new Personal Valet Clothes Vitalizing System. Whirlpool. Just imagine.
U.S. consumers spend over $8 billion on dry cleaning. The amazing feature is that 75% of this is just for removing odors or removing wrinkles. And ironing is one of the second most disliked chore at home, next only to washing windows. So this product which you have seen came from Whirlpool's research with consumers in trying to develop new solutions to the problem they face. It's called a Personal Valet, and you saw a little about how it works in the ads. It helps consumers clean and prepare clothes for wearing to work or to any function. They can do this at lower cost and greater convenience and less drudgery than the options now available, including making trips to the dry cleaners. The way it works is that the product circulates a fine mist in the cabinet where you hang your clothes to be cleaned. The mist consists of heat-activated formula produced by Procter & Gamble, and this formula permeates the fibers of the clothing, and it removes the odors. It also removes the wrinkles. You can add weights at the bottom if you want, and even a smoother look for your clothes. Thus, it reduces trips to the dry cleaner, and it also reduces the need for ironing. I have one of these at home, and it's fun to use, and the first time I had it, I couldn't stop finding clothes to clean. The gadget costs about $1,000 installed. It's 3 foot by 1 foot by 5 feet, and you can do up to about 3 clothes or 3 pieces of garments at a time. It fits in a bedroom or in a closet. Doesn't really need to be wired for water or for the exhaust. It just needs a 110 volt battery. Electricity outlet. I think the most interesting feature is that it works on almost all garments that we normally use, including wool, silk, leather, rayon, and items with beads and so on. So it is very flexible in that respect. The product was test marketed in 2001, 2002, though we were working with the company from 1996, and they launched it in 2002. Someday it could become a common product in the household. When we have described the product to people, they have said they'd like to have one immediately, though there might be others who might think it's not necessary. But it's whenever we face products like this, it's interesting to note that a lot of other appliances were initially considered unnecessary, including the microwave and the refrigerator when they first came out. To explain to you the problem that the company faced, I have this little graph with these 3 curves: the sales on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And sales of new products often follow the green curve. There's a long period of dormant or no sales or very little sales. And then suddenly, when the technology improves adequately, there's a sharp takeoff in sales. However, a lot of companies tend to forecast sales following the blue curve, a linear forecast. And the problem arises as time proceeds. The gap between the blue curve and the green curve increases. And as that gap increases, there's pressure on the managers to pull the plug on the new product. That's where our analysis and our understanding of the takeoff would help managers to plan these events better. And Peter will explain to you how this model works. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to share this research with you. We think it's an exciting research problem and very relevant for Whirlpool, as I'll talk about, but we think it's relevant for any company that's facing a new product introduction situation, particularly in regards to consumer durables. And at the time that Whirlpool approached us, they had many questions. And I'm not going to read all of these now because I'll go through these questions really point by point through the presentation. But there was a lot of uncertainty, as there is with any company launching a new product. For some of these questions, there's really no research that existed, particularly with regard to the sales takeoff. There was some notion about that a takeoff existed, but for a lot of these questions, there was really no research that existed at the time that we started our research on sales takeoff. For some of the other questions, there are partial answers, and we hopefully added some insights to this. But for the sales takeoff, we think that some of our answers to Whirlpool were very new to them. Okay. Many people would think first of applying diffusion models to new product sales, and they've been usefully applied in many situations. We're grateful to the foremost researchers and really the pioneer of this field kind of pointing out some of the limitations of diffusion models with regard to the sales takeoff. From their review paper, they talk about not all new products are accepted by consumers at the time of their introduction. Some products are much slower than others in being accepted by potential adopters. That is, they differ in terms of how long it takes them to take off. The takeoff phenomenon is not considered explicitly in the BAS model. The BAS model assumes the presence of a certain number of consumers before takeoff. And for Whirlpool and for us, it's really that period prior to takeoff that we're primarily interested in. So our research was really proceeding along before Whirlpool had contacted us, kind of similar to their own product development. We were developing our research on sales takeoff. In the early 90s, we were collecting data. Mid-90s, kind of modeling and working with some of the measurement issues, and then had 2 years of review and refinement and improvement of the paper as it went through the marketing science review process. when Whirlpool first contacted us, one of the things we needed to do was broaden the data set. And the reason for doing that is we needed more products that were similar to what they were going to introduce. Because as I'll talk about in the model, one of the keys is having products that are analogous or most similar to the one that they want to introduce. So we added more kitchen appliances, we added more laundry appliances, and that helps us give a better estimate of prediction for their new product. Okay. So the first question, what is the typical pattern of early sales? So from diffusion research, we see the kind of S shape, but as Jerry showed in the earlier slide, we're interested in that period really before the takeoff. Whether it's flat, how long it's flat, you know, how dramatic that takeoff might be. Is it really sharp? Is it you know, fairly gradual takeoff? And how long does it take to get there? That's what Whirlpool wanted to know for the most part, and that's what we were interested in as well. So from this first slide, I'm going to show you 8 examples of categories and the early sales of those categories. So you can see from these graphs that in a lot of these categories, even when there's been very dormant sales for a long period of time, there is a fairly sharp and dramatic takeoff in these categories. And at this point, the category really changes dramatically. The amount of capacity that needs to be there to produce the volume that the market is demanding, the sales channels, all those things really need to change at this point of takeoff. Okay? Before that point, you know, the market is more focused, sales are more limited. Companies who spend a lot of money at this point in the process risk great losses, and as Jerry alluded to, pressure to pull the plug at that point. More broadly, if you look on average across the categories in our data set, you can see pretty much the same phenomenon. At takeoff, the market changes dramatically. You have sales, average sales in a few hundred thousand going up to over 1 million. And the real key to this is not just that there's a big increase in sales, but there's a big increase and it's a sustained increase. One increase in sales, you know, if it comes back to a lower point, may not be as important, but the takeoff really signals the start of the growth stage, and the firm really needs to reorient its business at this point. Sales are going up from 1 million to 2 million to 4 million in pretty quick succession. Okay. The second question is kind of already answered in the graphs that I just showed you, but at this point, you know, when Whirlpool contacted us, there was not the answer to this question. So what is the average increase? On average across categories, over 400%. And if you look at more recent categories, it's even a larger increase on average. You know, this is very substantial again, and companies want to know when they're going to get to this point. Okay. One of the key insights, I think, from the research that we did is this threshold measure of sales takeoff that we developed. And I want to describe this briefly. Essentially what this is the horizontal axis, the base sales, would be sales in the previous year. The percent increase is sales in the current year relative to sales in the previous year. So the way this would work with a new product is you would essentially plot points for each new product, second year relative to first year, third year relative to second year, fourth year relative to third year. You would plot those points. The first year in which that point for a new product was above the threshold would be the signal of the takeoff. We developed this threshold measure basically by looking at past categories, because when you have the entire sales history, it's fairly easy to see when the takeoff occurs just by visual inspection of the curves. But what we want to know is we want to have a measure to differentiate between a true takeoff and a short, possibly a temporary upward turn in sales from a true takeoff. So what this does is it allows us to differentiate between a slight increase in sales and a true sustained takeoff. And in the categories that we had in our marketing science paper, we found that this rule, this one simple rule, differentiated over 90% of the categories. So over 90% of the categories, the first time their sales increase relative to base sales crossed above this threshold, signaled the takeoff. So this tells us a couple things. One is that there's something generalizable happening. This appears to be a fairly consistent phenomenon that we can measure, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, that we can model and hopefully predict as well. Now, what is the time to take off? This is one of the key questions that Whirlpool certainly wanted to know. So once you have the takeoff measured, you know, we can collect data on when the product was introduced. Just on average, this tells you 11 years to take off. For more recent categories, it's 6 years, but that's still a long time. Whirlpool didn't want to hear this. I can't imagine any new product manager who does want to hear this. You know, you've got a great product. If you do everything right, it will take 6 years until it takes off. Nobody really wants to hear that, but it's good news for them to hear because they need to plan with this in mind. Products that do well eventually still take 6 years to take off. Question 4. I have several answers to this question that I want to present to you right now. So one of the things that we decided to do was to look for some patterns. So people want to know just generally, descriptively, what's happening in the market at or around takeoff. So I have a few slides on descriptive statistics. Penetration at takeoff on average around 3%, again lower for more recent categories. Okay? But this again represents fairly meaningful sales. 1.7% of households is going to be somewhere approaching 2 million households, so it's fairly significant cumulative sales. One of the interesting findings that we had from the research, I think, is this idea of price points at takeoff. And it's important to recognize that these are in nominal dollars. So there's no correction for inflation here. And our basic feeling here is that they're psychological price points for consumers. And that as products start at a high price and as they drop below these price points, that they suddenly seem affordable, they suddenly seem like a good deal to consumers. So this was important to Whirlpool because it helps them think about what price they need to launch at relative to what price they might reach a sales takeoff. So if they want to price at $1,000 at takeoff, maybe they want to be above that point at launch. If they want to take off at $500, then the initial price is going to be a little bit different. But a lot of the categories had takeoffs at or around these price points. Okay. In terms of price reductions are significant. Again, particularly for the more recent categories, the price at takeoff, 63% of the price at commercialization. These are fairly substantial price reductions over a 6-year period. In some ways, consumers expect these, so I think companies need to plan around those consumer expectations. Okay. Now we really get to the heart of the question for Whirlpool, and that is, can we model and predict this event? Okay, so the threshold measure gives us some idea about when it's happening at that point in time, but Whirlpool's in the situation they haven't launched this yet. They want to get some idea about how long it's going to take, what are the variables that might impact the takeoff. So this is really the heart of the work that we did for them. So as I've discussed, takeoff is really a duration time event. You're looking at the point from launch or commercialization until takeoff. The best way to look at these duration time events is through hazard models. So that's the approach that we took. It's a proportional hazard model, and the probability of takeoff then is essentially a baseline hazard function capturing the effective time since commercialization, possibly also other covariates with time, and then we had additional explanatory variables in the model. The 3 variables that we had in the model are relative price, which is current price relative to price at commercialization. Both price and penetration are time-varying explanatory variables, so they change over time. What we found is that lower price promotes takeoff or is associated with takeoff. Higher penetration was also associated with takeoff. In the model, the year of commercialization was not significant. Probably the primary reason for that is because the faster price declines were explaining the difference in the time to take off for the more recent categories. So that's essentially the model that we had developed. Now, when we go to Whirlpool, one of the things they say initially is, and other managers that we talk to as well, they say, we have no idea how to predict this time before the research. So the simple heuristic to use is just the mean time to take off. Right? If you know nothing else, you can use the mean time to take off as some measure, and that was somewhat useful to them. But of course, we wanted to see how well the model did as well. So let me explain briefly what our approach is in terms of validating the model first in terms of its predictive ability. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to use no information about the category that we were predicting. So we would remove one target category. We would re-estimate the parameters without that category. Then we would use forecast explanatory variables based on the average of all the other categories. So essentially, the parameters and the forecast of the explanatory variables used no information about the target category, and then we developed forecasts for that target category. Essentially, we forecasted takeoff when the probability of takeoff exceeded 50%. So that's how we did it in the marketing science paper. What we found is we're able to do predictions 1 year ahead by sort of updating with the actual penetration and price for the category of interest. But more importantly, from Whirlpool's perspective and from our perspective, we could also do a forecast of takeoff before launch, before commercialization. And that's the point where they were at, so they were primarily interested in that type of forecast. In the data that we had in the marketing science paper, the average prediction error was 1.9 years. Again, more accuracy would be better, but at this point, managers really knew nothing. And the key point about the model prediction is that it still reduces the prediction error from just using the mean time to take off. So the mean time to take off gives a certain prediction error. Using the model gives us further reduction of 26% in terms of prediction error. So we feel like the model is telling us something and giving some ability to predict takeoff. And again, the key is you're doing this many years before the event even happens. You're doing it before the company's even launched. Okay. Now, from Whirlpool's perspective, can they manage this process? So how do they manage this process? The two inputs to the model really are price and penetration. So what we did first is we wanted to get model parameters. We took the subset of categories that was most relevant to the personal valet, primarily kitchen laundry appliances, some other more recent categories that would give us a more modern kind of hazard baseline. And we asked them what kind of price path they wanted to consider. They knew what their costs were, they knew what their constraints were, they knew what their strategy was in terms of pricing. So they're able to play around with different price points, they're able to play around with different price paths, and we can estimate the probability of takeoff based on those scenarios. When we ask them about penetration paths over time, of course, they don't know, but we have some idea based on the data that we have. So we could give them a set of analogous products, look at the penetration paths for those products over time, and put those into the model. And after doing that, the primary results are curves such as the following. So essentially, these curves reflect kind of one typical penetration path for analogous products at 3 different rates of annual price reduction. So you can see from the top red line that the peak probability of takeoff is higher and comes a little bit sooner. And that's what companies want to do, but they have to balance off trying to get an earlier takeoff with the lower margins that would come with the faster price reductions. So this is a managerial question for them to answer, but this gives them the information to at least be able to address that issue. You can see from the second curve here that if you look at 15%, 10%, 5% annual reductions, that the differences in probability of takeoff are much greater at this point. So you can see the impact of price within the model, and companies would be very interested in having kind of 50% cumulative probability of takeoff within a 3 or 4 year window. If they can get to that point and still do it profitably, that's something that a company like Whirlpool or another company would be interested in doing. So these were the curves that they were probably most interested in looking at during our analysis, and asked us over and over again to, what about this scenario, what about this scenario, what if the penetration path is this, what if the price path is this? And this gave them something that they felt like they could work with. It gave them something that they could create different scenarios. It allowed them internally, I think, really to look at profitability relative to the different price paths and try and trade off the probability of takeoff versus the short-term losses and possibly the long-term gains. So a lot of the work that we did for them really revolved around generating these curves, giving them some sense of probability of takeoff. Because again, that was the key issue for them. They didn't want to be in this dormant period for a long period of time. Whirlpool, like all companies, want to get to that point of takeoff. Okay. Now, question 7, how to price the new product. There's other literature, obviously, that deals with this. Some of the insights from our paper that we could add to what Whirlpool already might have known. I think one of the keys is this idea of relative price. The price points at takeoff give some indication that relative price is important, but this again suggests that they want to consider a launch price that may be very different from what the price is going to be at takeoff. So again, they have to trade this off with what their own costs are, but they should consider really commercialization price certainly above what price they want to take off, and possibly far above what they want to take off. Because a higher price, again, is going to set a higher reference level. It may make the product seem like more of a good deal when it crosses below a certain price point. Okay. Question 8, how much to spend on advertising? Obviously, this is important also, and there's other research that deals with this. The key for us really here is associating the low probability of takeoff, the possibly long time to, and the long time to take off, with the losses that could be incurred during that period. So companies that go with a big advertising budget in year one are almost certain to suffer losses in these categories. The losses can be quite substantial. I'll give you an example later in the presentation, but the losses can be very substantial. So depending on the internal support, the managers of these individual products need to gauge how large the losses can be before there'll be higher level pressure to just get out of this category. And the managers, of course, don't want to do that, so they have to manage this situation so that the losses are not that great. Similarly, for distribution, they want to be possibly more cautious if the markets are going to be more focused early on. Okay. Let me talk about the specific impact at Whirlpool. So I think, as you can tell from the research on sales takeoff, this really helps managers be more cautious about their sales goals. It helped Whirlpool. They would have likely forecasted the linear sales growth that Jerry showed on the earlier slide. This would have created a couple of situations. One is, they might not have even launched after test market, but it would have created great pressure to pull the plug on the product. And the managers who are launching it don't want that to happen. But these new products need time to succeed. So if the plug is pulled quickly, they really don't have that opportunity to succeed in the marketplace. So, so the application led to this cautious launch strategy, essentially giving it time to succeed. One of the ways that this cautious launch strategy was implemented was through the selection of channel partners. Rather than launch to the mass market, they decided to launch to the builder or contract distributor market. And as you can see from this quote from the Director of New Business Development, whether you are building a new home or are investing in or interested in having a personal valet system installed in your current home, your local authorized contract distributor is an ideal place to learn more about it. So at this point, they get the feeling the product's not ready for the mass market. There is more explaining that needs to go along with this new product. So these more focused channels, these channels with greater salesperson impact are more appropriate for this type of new product. Similarly, another distribution channel partner was California Closets. And just like with the authorized contract distributors, California Closets provides the selling and the support that goes along with this new product. They're also focused on more of a market niche where the product is more likely to be suitable in its early stages. Okay. So the cautious launch strategy, as I talked about, was implemented through the distribution channels. The cautious launch strategy also came about through the advertising. And when we started with them in 1996, there was no advertising budget, so it's difficult to establish a baseline. And in some ways, that's true with a lot of the research that we did. In 1996, there was no real baseline. This is a brand new product. So it's difficult to say that sales increased X or cost decreased Y. It's essentially we have to compare with what other companies would have done in a similar situation. One of the comparisons you can look at here for advertising is a company like TiVo spent over $200 million in marketing, achieves less than 1% penetration. Those are huge losses that Whirlpool could not have afforded to sustain. Other products maybe more similar would be these carbon monoxide monitors, microwave ovens that spent anywhere in the range of $3 to $20 million a year. But again, those would be huge losses for a product like Personal Valet that is probably going to have limited sales early on. So their feeling based on our research is they wanted to focus on these more narrow channels, build word of mouth, and then be ready for a more mass market launch in the future. So as Jerry alluded to early on, new products often appear superfluous early on. You look at all these products, 1920s, 1940s, many of these new products, whether it's automobiles, color TVs, were not owned by consumers. When they first came out, they thought they didn't really have a need for them. But it takes time, and consumers eventually know more about these products. They become more of a standard. Their friends buy them, and they start to buy them. So in general, for new product success, price reductions are important, innovation is important, and as another point of comparison, you can look at things like laundry dryers. Just to reach 10% penetration took 20 years. Microwave ovens to reach 10% penetration took 15 years. So a slow takeoff would not be unlikely for Personal Valet. So in conclusion, really, for Personal Valet, our research, I think, really led them to have a more cautious launch strategy. It led to more realistic expectations. it led towards selecting focused channel partners, and it led towards a smaller advertising budget. And I think it gives the product time to succeed before there's too much pressure to withdraw it from the market. And I think those were the key impacts on what they did. The model, the ability to kind of predict takeoff under these various scenarios, gave them some ability to analyze the situation. Now, when you think about the situation beyond Whirlpool, here's some examples of how our research can be relevant. Essentially, we believe that this is really, our research is most relevant for managers at the greatest point of uncertainty. Before launch, they know nothing. Prior to our research, they would have known little, and our research gives them some insight. Our research was covered on the front page, of the Wall Street Journal. There were 40 inquiries as a result of this from new product managers basically facing similar situations. The marketing science paper was awarded the Bass Award for some recognition of its contribution to the discipline. MSI has also been supportive of the research. And McKinsey has contacted us about applications of the model, so we know it's being used within that company. A divorce case actually used it to kind of figure out the value of the assets, time of takeoff relative to time of marriage. But we think the product is useful in many new product situations. And lastly, just to show for TiVo how I think the threshold model works, if you look at kind of base sales in the previous year relative to sales growth in the current year, you can see that if projected sales hold up, this should be the first year that you would expect takeoff for TiVo. The previous years there was good sales growth, but again, relative to base sales, nowhere close to having a true and sustained takeoff. If these projected sales continue, this would be the first year that TiVo would be at or close to takeoff. So that's the relevance of this threshold measure. Thank you very much for your time today. It was a pleasure to share this research with you.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of questions for you. The first one is, if you go back to your original slide that showed the linear growth, the takeoff, and then the flat growth, the model, every individual product and product category in the model really was a success. There are no failures included in the model, so there's none of this. Every one of them had a takeoff. How do you know this is going to be a success? How do you know it will go through a takeoff?
We did two things in the model. For one, we introduced, in predicting the model, we removed a category, assuming that we knew nothing about that category. It's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that the model is primarily predicting the time to take off. So until that point in time, you do not know when it's going to occur. And that is the value to managers. And the way you can use it is in these curves which Peter showed you of the probability of takeoff. If after you cut price as much as it is as you can, given goal of profits, if when the probability of takeoff is highest and your product has not taken off, then probably there's reason to pull the plug. On the other hand, if you're well before that point, then there's good reason to wait.
Yeah. I think that there's other measures of how much people like the product, relative advantage that can be added to this. Our contribution, I think, is what Jerry mentioned, is that we can give them some measure of saying, if it hasn't taken off by now, this is time to pull the plug. So when the marginal probability of takeoff drops down to a very low point, if it hasn't happened, that's really a time to think about pulling the plug. So it's a heuristic for that as well.
My question is about implementation. How is this being planned to be used in the company in the future? How is this being institutionalized in the company? And who is taking ownership in the company?
Okay, well, I think one of the ways that they can use it going forward is that, as I showed in the presentation, we have the predictions at takeoff. We also have the predictions 1 year ahead. So the predictions 1 year ahead, they can incorporate actual market data and essentially use that as a base. And then you're forecasting the next year based on the patterns of analogous products. But having that base set by current product sales, penetration, price is important because that reduced the prediction error from 1.9 years to 1.2 years. So as you go forward with real data, you have prediction errors a year in advance of just about a year. So there's a very meaningful reduction in prediction error as the company starts to have real data. So that's how they can use it going forward. Just on this last slide where I showed the TiVo example, this threshold measure again gives you another heuristic, albeit in real time, but the importance again of this measure is that it doesn't tell you that you just had a blip in terms of an increase in sales. It tells you that you've started a true sustained growth stage where sales are going to go up for the next several years. So I think that's how they can use the model and the research results going forward. The product was just launched last year, so we're still in this period where they'll be collecting some of the pre-takeoff data, and they really just have one partial year at this point. They don't even have a full year of sales data, but that's how they can use the model going forward. In terms of institutionalizing it, the product is relevant for really new consumer durables. So it has, there are fewer applications than there might be with something focused on advertising or something that would be changed more continuously. The focus is really on these new product launches, and the value, I think, is that there's the most uncertainty about these situations. People know a lot more about other situations, but this is at least gives some answers in a situation where there's maximum uncertainty with the launch of these really new products.
So Whirlpool has assigned a model owner, if you want to consider it those terminologies, who is responsible for doing the yearly updating so that they can continue on tracking how well Personal Valet is used.
Joe Foster was doing this himself with a team of assistants, was actually doing the tracking. And he has just been transferred, so there'll be a new person taking over the job. And yes, so they are constantly tracking it. And previously, some of this was done by routine linear projections in the accounts department. Now it'll be done more based on the model and the data, and more by marketing and accounting and finance analysts. But the brand manager is responsible for the forecast and the change in strategy.
All the products in your model went with a mass market distribution strategy. Every single one of them. This is a major change in the marketing mix, and as we found out with all the pre-test marketing, forecast marketing tools, when you change the marketing mix from the model to actual commercialization, results change, and sometimes quite dramatically. How do you adjust the forecast, given that instead of focusing on a mass market, the strategy is to now go with a more limited distribution strategy and a more niche market rather than a mass market?
It's a good question. I think there are several categories in the data set that were not launched to a mass market. If you think about color TVs initially, when they were first launched, no networks were broadcasting in color TV. So that would have been a very niche market. And so I think the key there would be to pick the subset of products that were launched to a narrower market. The thing that they're doing may not be exactly what happened with other products, but what we would try to do is we try to get the products that were at least most similar in terms of being available not to everyone, but to a more specialized market initially. If you go back even to the early days of some of the old appliances, you would have had homes that weren't even wired for electricity when refrigerators came out, so that would have given some narrower focus to those categories. So I think we do have some categories that were more narrowly targeted when they first came out, possibly not as narrowly targeted, but what we would try to do within the model is to find the most analogous set of categories to what their current strategy is.